I read a lot about Bishop, a lot of interviews when I was writing my thesis, and she's a fascinating character. So the two poems that I'm going to read both have to do with who she is. And Bishop, for one thing, was also an artist. You can see on some of her paperbacks drawings that she did as cover art for her own work. And she was fascinated with and very conscious of color, and you can see that in the Moose because she mentions color a lot, especially in the first part of the poem when it's sunny outside. So this is about that first part, and I imagine her as being someone who might have had the quality of I forget the word for it now, there's a medical word for it, but seeing colors and detecting them through her other senses as well. Synesthesia. What is it again? Synesthesia. Synesthesia, thank you. Okay. Look at that, would you? When the silted red water of the Bay of Fundy rushes in, its return surprises. She'd forgotten how she's missed it. Even the mud flats at low tide, lavender rich as the scent. As her mind embraces colors, she recalls a distant touch, mother, who disappeared one morning while her child was out with the cow. Red sea at sunset, sailor's delight. Color always floods her, sends her to brushes, pencil box, to seek a match, capture. The silver birches glow. A bus's window flashes pink, the light deciding. She's never seen a sound before. In the dark, a collie's bark, orange. At church, purple when Aunt Grace sings the hymn. Her own voice to her ear, a pale blue-gray. One afternoon, she wades into the sea to test its grip. Cold, green, strong to seize the drowning. And the other one that I would like to read is about after the Moose, after she was still working on the poem, obviously, but she took a trip. She went on a cruise to Brazil. She wanted to travel. She called herself a person who had no home because her home had been this childhood home in Nova Scotia, but she was taken from there by another set of grandparents, and she felt like she was always without a home. So she went to Brazil, and she got sick there in Rio and met a woman named Lota, who became the love of her life, who nursed her back to health in her apartment. And Bishop was really, really quite ill then, but she and Lota became lovers and ended up in Brazil. She was there for quite some years. So this is called Elizabeth Bishop Recuperates at Lota's Apartment. I lay a limp balloon, lungs whistling like a train. You took me in, stroked my hair. Gatinha, you murmured, kitten, your Latin ah's a caress. Those first days I was elsewhere. Worcester, grandmother's bedroom, where I often lay sick after mother went away. I wheezed when the cat came near. The maid brought broth. No one touched me. Your palm cool on my forehead, your lotion cool on my arms, your compress cool on my eyes. You'd rise to shut the curtains, muffle the blare of Rio's taxi horns. Gatinha, Mama, I whispered. Thank you.
This is The Poet and the Poem from the Library of Congress. We are on remote. We are with Susan Okie today. She has a new book that's received quite a lot of acclaim, and we're going to hear about it. And first of all, here's Susan with an opening poem.
In the anatomy lab. That night, I unwrapped only her right hand and sat, probing to free the lovely network of cables in her palm. Some impulse made her give her body. I didn't know her name or one thing about her life. When I tugged on the flexor digitorum tendons, her fingers partly closed and her thumb crooked in. I seemed to see the two of us as if from outside and could no longer name the tendons. I felt my fingers from inside her hand. Soon I would open the gates of her ribs, would hold even her heart in my palm. Afterward, always home, to feel your palms circling on the small of my back.
You know, Susan, the wonderful thing about your poems is they have a message at the end. Tell us the title of this book and what you think you have said about yourself in this book.
Well, the book is called Woman at the Crossing, and I like that title. It's the title of I guess it's the title poem, but it was suggested to me that that should be the title of the whole book by David Keplinger, and I'm grateful for that, because I think it's about being at change points during life, all kinds of change. You know, I have poems about parenthood and motherhood. I have poems in which our family lived in Kenya for 3 years, which was a life-changing experience. I have poems about growing up, becoming a doctor, being a doctor, mortality, loss. So all of these are sort of crossings in a way, if you think about these different themes.
Yes, and because you are a physician, a mother, professor, you have been a medical reporter and writer, these are contextualized by the poems in the book. And I think it's really interesting the way poetry frames each part of your life. And so we're going to now hear another poem from these. From, give us the title again, Susan Okie.
I will. This poem is called Slippery, and it's dedicated to my husband, Walter. The hinge, crusted with mud, resists your effort. So you twist and saw, cut through the crack to turn a line into a mouth helplessly opening. You pry the shells apart to show gray flesh glistening in its seawater, and you pass it to me. I tip the bed and slide the cold body onto my tongue, like the afterbirth of a mermaid, salty, so mellifluous that I swallow it whole. Your turn, but you forget. Open me another.
Susan, I had to read that twice before I knew what it was about, before I knew it was about eating oysters. But I'll tell you, the thing that you do consistently is when you bring that poem home, you always make a very subtle statement. And this is a relationship poem.
Mm-hmm.
This and many of your poems are relationship poems. And I have always felt that a relationship would fail if one person felt she were given more than the other. That's the way I think relationships fail. This is the opposite of that. This is about someone who's giving more than they're getting. Would you read it again?
Of course. Slippery, for Walter. The hinge crusted with mud resists your effort, so you twist and saw, cut through the crack to turn a line into a mouth helplessly opening. You pry the shells apart to show gray flesh glistening in its seawater and pass it to me. I tip the bed and slide the cold body onto my tongue like the afterbirth of a mermaid, salty, so mellifluous that I swallow it whole. Your turn, but you forget. Open me another.
Susan Okie has had poems in journals of great significance, I think, and many of them. She's been doing readings all over the country and has some individual poems that have been prize winners. So let's hear another poem.
Okay, this is a doctor poem, and this poem was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's the only one I've ever had in there. It's called A Doctor's Eye, Ignacio's Foot. I know this foot, the sturdy stump that ends mid-instep in a calloused knob, the horny yellow skin slammed with each step against the sole of your salted working boot. I remember toes turning dusky like summer plums, the innocent-looking wound launching bacteria to melt your flesh. On your x-rays, infection's shadow crept up the bones till I sent you by taxi to the hospital, where a surgeon lopped off the darkened, rotting half. Mornings since your daughter took you in, you limp beside your grandson to the bus, clean the house, scrape together dollars to pay your fare. Today, you greet me with a toothless smile and show your numbers, high water marks of sugar in the blood. Tenderly, you unswaddle the stump, present it for my inspection. Look, perfecto. Next time you see me here, I will walk in with a woman on my arm.
Susan, you have had hundreds, if not thousands, of medical episodes. How do you know which one should be a poem?
Well, many of them are just, they're intimate conversations, but there's nothing about them that clings in my mind and sort of haunts me. Sometimes the ones that become poems are the ones that were traumatic for me as well as for the patient, something very difficult that happened. And sometimes there are people who inspire me, as this man did. He had been through so much, and yet his attitude was amazing. He was so upbeat all the time. He was brave. He didn't have the worst diabetes of any patient that we saw in the safety net clinic where I was working, but he just couldn't feel in his feet. And, he got this terrible infection without realizing there was something going on. And that can happen a lot in people who have, loss of sensation in their feet.
Where are the many places that you've practiced medicine in your life?
I was a resident.
From the beginning.
Okay. I went to Harvard Medical School, which is where I met my husband. I went into family medicine in Worcester, Massachusetts at the UMass program. I did the first year of internship there while my husband was, my partner then, Walter, was at another program in the area. And I got very burned out and depressed in that first year and felt like maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I can't do this. It just seemed overwhelming. It was exhausting. So we moved to DC because I had been an intern at the Washington Post as a medical student. I had 2 summers off, and there was an editor there who kept saying, "Come back here, we'll give you a job anytime." He wanted me to be a medical reporter, and I decided to do that. So Walter changed his residency and trained down here in Washington. And I went to the Post and was there for a few years in the time when Bob Woodward was, in charge of the Metro section. It was an exciting time to be a reporter there. And at a certain point, after 2 or 3 years reporting, I began to think, maybe I want to go back and try that residency again, see if I can complete it, because it felt unfinished. So I went to a different program in Hartford, Connecticut, and I finished at the UConn, University of Connecticut program. But then my husband decided he wanted to get into malaria research and give up clinical practice. And he joined the Navy in order to do that. And we ended up back in Washington, so I ended up back at the Post again. So it was kind of a seesaw, but I didn't really practice regularly until after I left the Post, after 20 years there, and then began volunteering at this safety net clinic in Montgomery County, where my husband is still volunteering. And I worked with patients there for 18 years. And my biggest asset there was that I speak good Spanish, and I had many, many Hispanic patients. And
that is an asset. Yes. And what is your professorship like?
I'm a adjunct faculty member at Georgetown Medical School, and over the years, my favorite thing to teach has been patient interviewing, because students have to learn how to ask questions and find out about a patient and get their story. So it's a little like journalism, and they're terrified when they start to do it, especially with real patients. So it was a lot of fun to teach that. And then with COVID, we began having to teach it on Zoom, and we began having to have actors play the patients because it wasn't safe to take medical students into the hospital. But the most fun was taking medical students into the hospital.
Well, you've had a rich life. There's enough material for, I think this is your first full-length book. I think you have a lot more from these experiences. So that we get more of you at one time, would you read the next poems two at once?
Yes.
Susan Okie is her name, Susan Okie.
The next poem is a Chincoteague poem. The poems that I have that are about oysters and the seaside all are based in Chincoteague, where we have a place that we go and spend time at. And Chincoteague is where they have the wild ponies. So this poem is called The Filly. She's not one of those who splay their feet and sink to the ground, trying to get away. She stands strong, slender legs under her, head erect on a long neck, looking at the crowd with a questioning eye. Palomino with ragged spots of cream, shining in cloud-filtered light, owning her body, forward in small, smooth steps into the arena, as if two strong men were not gripping her by the chest and haunches. Into the center they urge her, pivot her to face the faces, while another looks for bidders, shouts at a raised hand. The price climbs fast. She's tall, golden, all can sense her spirit. She can't know that beauty, heart, even that pale coat have marked her to become a broodmare on the refuge. Tomorrow, when other foals are loaded into trailers to learn about the bit for some child's pleasure, she'll wade into the channel with the wild herd, swim back to the island with her mother. And a second poem. This poem is for Sally Kristen Ride. She was my best friend in high school, the astronaut. And this poem is called Within Bounds. When we met, a blade flashed in your eye. Some signal made of light passed through my body. Your father made you wear a tennis skirt for matches. You cared only to move, connect, smash. I'd tag along to watch you explode, chase down a drive, wham it, backhand. And if it fell outside the line, your face and your father's reddened, but no curse, no word, no sound. That game I too could play. I'd trained for it, learned what questions would make my father fall silent, leave the room. So we'd lie on the grass side by side, not touching, talk about the universe's edges rushing away, never about love.
Tell us about Sally Ride.
Sally was, she called herself a proud underachiever in high school. We were at a girls' school together. She was on the tennis team. She was a terrific tennis player. And at one point thought about becoming a professional, but she was a bit too short to have as much of a strong, move from side to side as she might have if she were taller. But she was an excellent athlete. She was guarded. I think we sort of know that from her story as an astronaut. There were many personal things that she didn't talk about. She didn't talk about personal things very much when I knew her, but she loved pranks. She loved jokes. She had a great sense of humor. She had not much patience for pompous teachers or teachers who she didn't like. She didn't mind not working as hard as her father urged her to do. He wanted her to be a real champion in tennis.
It looks like that.
Yeah, we both were very close to our fathers, but I would say those fathers, although we were sort of the apples of their eyes, they're these daughters, they weren't emotionally very expressive. And Sally's family was pretty buttoned up that way, and so was mine, honestly. So we had that in common, and we were very, very close friends. We also loved science, both liked science, but Sally wanted to be an astronomer from the get-go.
Wonderful. What a story. You need to write more about her. The poem is full of that distance between people. It's full of silence, really. And you get a lot of information about relationships here. But did parents of that generation talk about love, though? Did parents of your generation show much affection usually? Or do you think that it was unusual that your parents were kind of formal?
I don't think it was unusual. My parents had been in the war together. That was where they'd met. They'd met in Australia during World War II. And, veterans of that war are famous for not talking about it. They weren't in combat, but they didn't talk about their experiences much. And when it came to, teaching you about the facts of life, when you're a teenager, my mother tried, but she didn't make it clear at all what she was
I
saying.
don't know. Mine didn't bother. That's true. That was definitely not a subject you talked about.
Mhm.
And here you became a physician and learned all about it in the lab. But I like this poem a lot because it's a character portrait. It has relationships in it, and also it has a complexity because you and the writer and the character in themselves cannot reach across the chasm.
That's right.
That is wonderful. But yet, lying side by side talking about the universe is a kind of love.
Mhm.
Don't you believe? There's
I
a kind
do.
of love, yes.
Mhm.
So I think you do a lot in a poem, and I'm sure you're not conscious when you set out to write it. You just tell the story as you've done. But what comes out with a seasoned writer is layers of meaning. And I like this a lot.
Thank you.
Also, your poems are really consistent on the page. Do you think you have one kind of energy that seems to form your stanzas exactly so?
I don't know. It is true that there's a consistency across the book in terms of structure. I have one poem that looks weird and different from the others because it's about 9/11, and it tries to create the sense of how confusing and inscrutable that whole day was, the day of the planes flying into the buildings.
Where
But
were you?
I was driving into DC on my way to the Washington Post to work when I heard on the radio a plane has flown into a building in New York. And I thought, well, that's strange. It's a clear day, it's a gorgeous day. How could a plane do that? And then, I kept driving and there was another message about a plane that's flown into the Pentagon. And I thought, something's happening. Something important is happening. I have to get to work. I have to report this. We all have to get on, into the newsroom right away. Should I yell out and tell people? It was just, we got there to the newsroom and everybody was there and there was no way you could report anything because we had no information. All we could do was watch the building fall down on TV. It was a horrible day.
It was a horrible day. Let's hear two more poems, and then I would love to hear about your life in Kenya.
Okay, well, next one of these is about Kenya. The rains begin in Western Kenya, 1991. All through the dry season, I swallow my tears. I don't sleep, eat without tasting, wander the house without seeing my children. Across the Atlantic, my mother has died. Tunes from the Requiem of Mozart sing day and night in my brain. On the morning the air tastes different, a wind rustles, ignites scarlet blossoms on the flame tree, as if to burn the branches to ash. Giant toads appear like stones, stick out their tongues at the sky. Night, thunder, waterfall of rain. From the lake, flying ants arise into the sky over marshes, villages, drop into the mouths of toads, dogs, children, fill everything that is empty.
And let's hear the next. I think that the next poem also came from Kenya, right?
Yes, it did. Yes.
Okay, let us hear that one.
All right. On Lake Victoria, 1992, for Peter Ochumba. Above rare fish with gaping mouths we float, motor dead. The lake's warm as soup, noon light blinking off your glasses as you pull the starter cord. Your goal to save the strange species that live only here. Between us, one water bottle, little fuel, no shade, no paddle, miles from shore. The villages with rough-sawn fishing boats, young men asleep in huts, their flesh melting from AIDS. This lake, a highway for fishermen, smugglers, viruses. You in your frayed hat, a scientist who lacks sample jars, aquarium, your limbs bony too, pretending the weekend funerals have nothing to do with you. Shadow of a huge perch slips beneath the boat. The motor coughs, starts.
Mm. What a good character study that is. And what were you doing in that boat?
Well, when I was in Kenya, my husband was working on malaria. My kids were in a little international school there in this town, Kisumu, which was on Lake Victoria, as it says. And I was reporting. I was doing as many stories as I could from Africa for the Post. They had agreed that I could do that. They had somebody covering the war in uh, Somalia, and they didn't have anybody or never had anybody to do just sort of science stories or other kinds of features. So I found things to write about. And Peter Ochumba was a scientist. He was a local guy. He was interested in saving these rare fish that they had in Lake Victoria, which were threatened by the Nile perch, which had been introduced as a fish, an eating fish and a source of income, but they weren't native. And he had a relationship with a scientist in Boston, I think, who came over and would work with him. But no, he didn't really have, scientific resources. He
Hmm.
just really wanted to save the fish.
Did he do valuable work without resources?
He did what he could. He would, try to keep track of the fish. I think he needed a lot more resources than he had. But the problem with AIDS at that time in Kenya was really rampant. There were no drugs for AIDS there at that time. They didn't even have any drugs for any of the infections that AIDS could bring along. And so there were just deaths of professional people, doctors, lab techs, anybody. It was all over, and there were funerals every weekend, literally.
How did that change your life living in Kenya?
Well, we had a wonderful experience there. I mean, sad in the sense that there was this terrible epidemic going on, but at the same time, I felt like I was doing something important in finding ways to report on the environment, the lake, AIDS itself. I did stories on that. It was wonderful to have that opportunity to be able to find things to write about and send them off and have them, have people learn about them.
Right.
But we also made close friends. My kids felt a real sense of community there. And I would say that living in a multicultural, multi-race environment like that was a wonderful experience for my children. It was just completely different from race in America, I would say.
What was your daily living like? I mean, did you have stores? What was the level of sophistication?
There was a open market where we went to buy a lot of our foods. There were some grocery stores. There were in Kisumu. There were stores run by entrepreneurs who were often Indians. By having moved to Kenya, they were from India but had emigrated, or their families had emigrated. Some of them had come over. Historically had ancestors come to build the railroad that the British built across Kenya. My kids had friends from all over the place. There were missionaries in their school and missionary children, tremendous varieties of people. We had a housekeeper named Judith, who I have poems about, who both took care of my kids and would cook and make tea and things like that. She was a wonderful person. She had kids of her own who she had to support on her own, because her husband had gone off with another wife and wasn't giving her any support. So, life was tough for a lot of people there, but we made a lot of friends and really got to see a whole other world.
As I say, you have plenty to write about, and you have written 2 books of nonfiction. What are they about?
One of them I wrote with Sally, about going into space. She did a lot of the writing. She sort of collected all the materials because she was the one who had gone into space. Um, I wrote a book about the epidemic of childhood obesity in the United States. I was encouraged to do that by people that I knew in the Academy of Medicine downtown, and it had just gotten attention. The idea that obesity in children was a new epidemic in America, and it's still a problem. So I wrote that book several years ago now.
So you have 2 different brains, right? Or 2 different parts of you. What happens when you have to shift gears and go into fiction and go into the feeling part of yourself? How does that shift happen?
Well, I think it happened sort of at the point when I was about 20 years a reporter. I had always been, writing nonfiction and not putting my opinion in, because at the Post we were taught, you give the reader the first chance at the facts. You don't say what you think, you tell us what you've learned. So that was what we did. And but at a certain point, I kind of rediscovered writing poetry. I took a little workshop and I really enjoyed it. And I realized that I wanted to write about what I was feeling. I wanted to have that experience too, and I couldn't have it as a reporter.
And
So
you did, and you did, and you did with this book. And what is the title again?
it's called Woman at the Crossing.
And now we're going to hear a final poem.
Okay. Two mothers. Hannah comes in like the sun, gathers up my 3-year-old, who laughs to feel her hug. She doesn't grab the baby, Jacob, waits to see where she'll fit in the network of our needs. Maternity leave's over. I want her as my mother. Of her life, I only hear the outline. She fled Cameroon, husband's always working. His mother in Virginia tends their child while Hannah cares for mine. That feels wrong. Not to worry, she tells me. In their culture, it's grandma's job. When Jacob cries, she wraps him in a shawl on her back to ride while she does dishes. Evenings, my breasts aching, I hurry home to nurse, but she can never let him cry when he wants a bottle. My milk dries up, unneeded. Walking one summer morning, Jacob at 2 holds my hand on the lane beside our house. I'm chatting with another mom when he spots Hannah coming. He lets go, runs ahead to greet her. How wonderful, my neighbor murmurs. That's what you want.
The irony and the beauty of Susan Okie. And this is the program, The Poet and the Poem, from the Library of Congress.
She's going to read her own words. Susan Okie.
And very excited to see you all, and excited to be reading from Woman at the Crossing, which hasn't been around for very long. It's brand new. So I will start without too much ado. I wanted to start with a poem which I dedicate to Stanley Plumley, who was a teacher for some of us here at the Writers Center. Very important in my life and for all of those who I think studied with him. And this poem also takes place in Chincoteague, Virginia, where Walter and I go down and spend a lot of time. So it has sort of beach scene, and it's a place that really feeds my writing and my soul in general. The black dog wakes us with fish breath. She found a ripe one in the muck on her first dash. She reeks of it. Drunk on the smell, she sneaks out, runs full tilt up down the wet lawn. Over my head, 2 Canada geese pass, honking, creaking. The wind's picked up, but can't drown the roar of waves from the barrier beach. The surf will reach 6 feet tonight. Down by the channel, birdsong carries. I can hear willets piping on their nests in the marsh on the far side. My teacher died last week. He told us, come to the page with a full heart and an empty mind. He'd walked the paths where Keats walked in Hampshire when the poet wrote his great ode to the dying season. He'd hoped to work at his desk till fall, revise as he watched the leaves turn, recalling elms, crowns of airy dreams. But it's April, the leaves still in bud, everything swelling, opening. From a near pine, a mockingbird carols. A flock of peeps skims the water, looking to land on an oyster bar. A dead fish is cause for rejoicing. This next one is called In the Anatomy Lab. It goes back to starting medical school. And it's really important to me as a memory of entering that world of studying medicine. In the anatomy lab, that night I unwrapped only her right hand and sat probing to free the lovely network of cables in her palm. Some impulse made her give her body. I didn't know her name or one thing about her life. When I tugged on the flexor digitorum tendons, her fingers partly closed and her thumb crooked in. I seemed to see the two of us as if from outside and could no longer name the tendons. I felt my fingers from inside her hand. Soon I would open the gates of her ribs, would hold even her heart in my palm. Afterward, always home, to feel your palms circling on the small of my back. You heard that we went to Kenya. It was a incredibly life-changing 3 years, lived there. But early on in our arrival in Kenya, there was a shocking event for me. I'm going to read this poem. It's called The Rains Begin in Western Kenya, 1991. All through the dry season, I swallow my tears. I don't sleep, eat without tasting, wander the house without seeing my children. Across the Atlantic, my mother has died. Tunes from the Requiem of Mozart sing day and night in my brain. On the morning the air tastes different, a wind rustles, ignites scarlet blossoms on the flame tree as if to burn the branches to ash. Giant toads appear like stones, stick out their tongues at the sky. Night, thunder, waterfall of rain. From the lake, flying ants rise into the sky over marshes. Villages drop into the mouths of toads, dogs, children, fill everything that is empty. The next book is a title poem for the book. It's Woman at the Crossing. And I see this poem asking what some of my other poems also do ask, which is really, what do we owe other people? How should we behave, and what should we do for other people? Woman at the Crossing. While wearing my white coat, I see a woman in pain. I ask about her life, touch her shoulder, listen to her heart, order an X-ray. On the traffic island outside the clinic, a woman with a sign stands in the cold, and I squint to read, hungry, lost my job, 3 kids. The light changes, and I drive on behind safety glass. This woman at the crossing, Desperate soul, racketeer, both? One day I'll park, walk back to speak with her. So my favorite poet, probably a big influence, is Elizabeth Bishop. I read a lot of Elizabeth Bishop when I was doing my MFA, and I wrote my MFA essay about her, so I read her life and everything. This poem is about an event when she was a child in Nova Scotia. She was her father was from Nova Scotia, I believe, and or maybe it's the other way around. Her father was from Massachusetts and her mother was from Nova Scotia. But her father died when Bishop was a baby, and she and her mother moved to Great Village, Nova Scotia, and lived with Bishop's grandmother and other relatives. But Bishop's mother became severely mentally ill, and she was basically taken away and put in a mental hospital and stayed there till she died. And Bishop was a very small child when that happened, and she never saw her mother again. So, in Great Village, did the hue of your walls, turquoise edging toward violet in some lights, tune your mind to color? Taller than wide, top of the stairs, your own space in grandmother's house, filled with aunts and uncle, the baby who died that first winter. Voices at night, steps up, down, boots knocking off snow on the scraper by the door. When she was all right, your mother read you tales of Anderson, showed you dresses she admired in magazines. Her perfume stayed on your pillow, her black and white striped skirt whispered as she went out. 2. At sunset, you'll take the dirt road toward the bay. Near the crest, a fox will come out of the grass and look at you, orange-brown against the red clay. You will keep walking until you can see his whiskers, narrow gaze. When he vanishes, you'll tiptoe, shoes scuffling on pebbles. Pastures will fall away. The tide will rush over its red bed, a tongue blue of sky, gold of cloud. You'll look until you disappear in the colors. Once the fox will scream, send you running home, crying, so you can't say what scared you. You've heard the sound before in your grandmother's house. Next poem is called The Dictionary, and it's a bit of a look at my relationship with my father, who I was close to, but it was hard to feel like you were close to him because he didn't talk much about his feelings or his childhood or tell stories. But this was a way that we did relate. It's called The Dictionary. Profluvium, a flowing out. Massive, mustard colored, too heavy for a child to lift. All its life, it's lived on this wooden stand built to hold a big book. At dinner, if my father used a word I didn't know, he'd send me to the stand in my parents' bedroom, make me look it up. So thin the pages, yellowed now, so small the type, so difficult to spy the word, hiding in a field of text. Herpetic, reptilian, raptor, an abandoned order consisting of the birds of prey as the hawks, eagles, vultures, owls. Once seized, I'd carry the definition back to the table. My father would say more about the word, how to use it. Minuet, a slow, graceful dance consisting of a coupé, a high step, and a balance. In my teens, I grew to resent the book and its rules, the order to stop eating, march down the hall to find a word. But my father was most present during those interruptions, eager to share a love of language. Heterodox, contrary to or different from some acknowledged standard. When he died, the book came to me. It waits on its stand, under a window near my dining room, redound, to rise or surge as water. Um, my best friend in high school, you may not believe this, but it's true, was Sally Ride, who became the astronaut. And we had things in common. We were really interested in science. We loved our science teacher who taught us human physiology, which was a rare thing that you could, most places don't have that at a high school, but this woman had been a scientist and she had left her job and came to be a teacher. Sally and I were in a carpool together. We spent a lot of time together. We stayed on the phone together. And as you may know, she was also a person who didn't necessarily open up to everybody. So this is called Within Bounds for Sally Kristen Ride. When we met, a blade flashed in your eye. Some signal made of light passed through my body. Your father made you wear a tennis skirt for matches. You cared only to move, connect, smash. I'd tag along to watch you explode, chase down a drive, wham it, backhand. And if it fell outside the line, your face and your father's reddened, but no curse, no word, no sound. That game I too could play. I'd trained for it, learned what questions would make my father fall silent, leave the room. So we'd lie on the grass side by side, not touching, talk about the universe's edges, rushing away. Never about love. Watching the timer here. Okay. In Kenya, where we spent 3 years, AIDS was absolutely rampant at the time. It was the early 1990s, and there were no drugs to treat it, and there were really no drugs available for the infections that people got when they had AIDS. So it was a bad situation. And this poem was called On Lake Victoria, 1992, dedicated to Peter Ochumba. Above rare fish with gaping mouths, we float, motor dead. The lake's warm as soup, noonlight blinking off your glasses as you pull the starter cord. Your goal to save the strange species that live only here. Between us, one water bottle, little fuel, no shade, no paddle, miles from shore. The villages with rough sawn fishing boats, young men asleep in huts, their flesh melting from AIDS. This lake, a highway for fishermen, smugglers, viruses. You in your frayed hat, a scientist who lacks sample jars, aquarium, your limbs bony too, pretending the weekend funerals have nothing to do with you. Shadow of a huge perch slips beneath the boat. The motor coughs, starts. Okay, I'm going to read a medical poem. This is about a patient, or an encounter with a patient that I had here, volunteering at the clinic. And that's all I really need to say. The new patient. Old man in your loose shirt, hooded gaze that says, look elsewhere. I see you. Don't I? Grasping your cane, clear eyes, white fuzzy hair, but your edges blur, disappear. On a desert road, I met a coyote, fur like a beaten rug, the color of drought. He never slowed, and with a cold eye, stared me down, dared me to watch him lope past. I looked away, walked fast. You've got his look, his camouflage coat. It's your legs bringing you in. You have to throw a leg out sideways from the hip to take each step. How long has this been going on? Below the knees, you're numb, heart racing, ribs sticking out like chicken wings. The more I ask, the more you look away. You've got a daughter in the city. Once in a while she calls. You're fine alone, have been for 30 years. Drink? Brandy to sleep? You spread your fingers, show me the depth of a good swig. In your glance, something reminds me of my father, how he'd fend off questions, never let me in. You're sicker than you know. I'd tick off blood tests, talk past you to the nurse, who'll call you, maybe get you back. But I can feel you weighing whether coming here was such a clever move. Better to turn off into thorny scrub, blend in, pretend you never saw me. This road might lead to the rancher with a shotgun, not down to the stream under the sycamores. Well, I'm almost to the end. I want to read, I have a number of poems about motherhood that I haven't really read tonight. There are too many to read, but when we were in Kenya, as in other places, even at home, I had help with people watching my kids, and we had a nanny in Kenya, we had a nanny at home. But this poem was about our nanny in Kenya, whose name was Judith. Judith, growling the mother mockingbird, a sound unlike her usual, more like a raccoon with rabies. She launches herself from the railing to chase crows, sparrows, anything alive and close to her nest, even me practicing yoga on the deck. When we moved to Kenya, I'd dream of green mambas biting my boys. For a headache, I'd drive them to the hospital, sure it was malaria. Sometimes it was. But when a pickup rounding a blind corner collided with Jacob's bike, I didn't sense the blow. It was Judith, our nanny, who heard the brakes, ran ahead to where a man stood shouting and lifted my son from the red dirt, weeping but unhurt. One more, okay. This will be the last. Another Chincoteague poem. On the dock in the dark. No moon tonight. As we sit under stars that blaze and wobble, dolphins draw near, exhale in loud huffs, so close we smell a fishy scent. Perhaps they heard us talking. My mother believed dolphins were a spirit animal, one she might become in another life, a fate she'd welcome. If they're speaking of us, the clicks and tones are muffled by the water, but nearness is enough for company. When we scattered my father's ashes in a different ocean, dolphins followed our boat back to the port at San Pedro. My mother said one was my father. Now when I miss my parents, I seek the dock in daylight, talk to them. Sometimes a pod of dolphins swims by, never as near as right now, a night so still that I can see the Milky Way reflected in the sea. So my poem is called But Potatoes. Fear food flying fruitlessly. The lettuce leaf flung sticks to Matisse. Please no pesto pouting at pastry. Conflicted sauce is no critic. There's no pear there. Utter mousse upsets the label's ambiguity. Dear, observe. Please do not help yourself. Spend a soupçon of pose upon the sofa. Comestibles in these positions are to be heard, not eaten. Some love okra, some babies. Some prefer baby okras. Tiny, tender green arriving in their little peaked caps. But potatoes, lumpen, bumpy, Form is unimportant. We crave bland granularity. Form disappears. Texture never disappoints. Babies, immigrants, potatoes, safe harbor for butter, a soothing palate massage. Alas, not immortal. A failed potato crop spells famine.